Chapter 3. The Dreamworld. Later that night, she felt at least brave enough to write in her blue journal about her husband, Duncan. One of the only things she'd ever been grateful for after the divorce was the fact that they'd never had children. He'd been understanding to a degree, and she'd been fair to a point. They had both been childish, but Duncan had expected too much from Delwyn. It became obvious to her that she'd been expected to be the surrogate mother, rather than lover or partner. He had come to resent her needing him, his strength, support, love and compassion. In the end, she wondered why he'd bothered, and in turn, why she had cared. It had become easier for her to hide in a haze of marijuana, and when she couldn't get her hands on that, red wine. Then the episodes had become more frequent, and she only went to work sporadically, self-medicating and hibernating on the couch, then finally in the bed in the spare room. The day she lost her job was the day Duncan finally lost his patience. He tried to give her ultimatums, but she answered with riddles such as, "Don't you love me? Don't you care? Is money all you care about? What am I to you?" He tried to arrange an intervention of sorts, but it backfired, with her friends and relatives turning on him. It was the first time that her mother had defended her, but it was short-lived, as she had arrived drunk and forgot where she was and who she was talking to. Duncan moved out into his brother's place, leaving Delwyn to fend for herself, but she let it go, housework and all, slipping into an abyss. Much later, when he came back to get the rest of his things and saw what condition the house was in, he had her committed with the help of her mother. They cleaned and sold the house, putting her possessions in storage, which was his last kindness, and then filed for divorce. It was quickly granted. As Delwyn wrote, she didn't notice the angry and shameful tears seeping out of her, soaking her shirt. It wasn't until Gwen put her head in around the door that she looked up and felt the cold material against her chest. Then Gwen opened the door fully and the dog scampered in, sniffing and jumping up on the bed. "Are you all right, love?" Delwyn wiped her face with her sleeve and shrugged, embarrassed and slightly annoyed that her aunt hadn't knocked. She remembered a friend telling her once that when she'd moved back home with her parents, her mother had a habit of just barging into her bedroom without knocking. She'd complained to Delwyn, saying, "What if I was using a vibrator?" Delwyn had laughed heartily back then, but not much made her laugh these days. "Just writing in my journal." "Get off, Dougie." She pushed the dogs off her bed and Gwen called them. "Dougie, Zeus, come on, out." They dutifully bolted out through the door, nearly bowling Gwen over. "Well, I'm going to get dinner started. Want to help?" She didn't want to, but felt obliged, so she dragged herself up and changed shirts as Gwen made her way to the kitchen. As they prepared dinner, Gwen gently pressed her for what had made her cry. Delwyn felt that she deserved to know, seeing as she'd taken her into her home. She agreed that she never really grew up, but that her mother had never really given her the confidence to do so. She also agreed that it was time to deal with it, to put it behind her and move on. She was relieved to hear Gwen say, "I'm not saying that you can't retain the child within. Heavens, don't dry up like an old prune and wither away." Secretly, she'd always hoped to lose herself in an alternate universe, as the real world was too daunting, too real and too demanding. She felt like a dog chasing its tail. The quandary of knowing what needed to be done but not wanting to do it. For now it was easier to say what her aunt and whatever doctors she would see would want to hear her say. "Yes, I want to rejoin the world. Yes, I want a normal life. Yes, I want to be an adult. Yes, I want to be responsible." She knew that, in essence, she needed to find all the fragmented pieces of her puzzles and put them all together in some sense of order. She needed to create a persona that actually existed in the world, rather than continue to be the product of smoke and mirrors. She needed to pick up where her parents left off, such as it was. She needed to grow up and get into it. Gwen talked about the time when Delwyn's parents divorced and how sorry she was and how she and Uncle Sean had wanted to kidnap her. "I wish you could have, but after Jane was gone. Sorry, but she scared me so much." Gwen laughed quietly as she chopped the carrots. "Yes, I know." She looked out of the window, lost in thought, and then said, "I remember taking you to the doctor's. When your mother was too busy, of course. We were visiting and she had to work. They had just divorced and you were so little and quiet as a mouse, small and white as a ghost." She threw the carrots in the pan and wiped her hands on her apron, sighing sadly with the memory, staring off into space. "The doctor had said, 'This little girl is severely traumatized.' I was heartbroken. I told your mother. She stared at me with those cold eyes and said, 'She needs to toughen up, spineless like her father.' I wanted to slap her so hard. You could not reason with that woman." She glanced over at Delwyn, who shrugged but then became animated. "I remember her sitting me down after they went to court for custody. She won and she sat me down on the bed and told me that she only fought for me to hurt Dad. Can you believe it?" Gwen stared at Delwyn for a moment, waiting for tears that never came. They continued talking about how Delwyn was constantly put down by her mother and how her father never came to her rescue. Delwyn told Gwen how Duncan was probably a male version of her mother, which was a revelation to her aunt. "You should tell the doctor that when you go. I think that's significant." Delwyn snorted and they laughed, deciding to change the subject. After dinner, Delwyn asked to see the photo albums that Gwen had stuffed away in the bottom of a cabinet in the living room. As her aunt snored away in the old recliner, Delwyn flipped the sticky boards past unknown faces and forgotten times that meant nothing to her, but nonetheless saddened her for that very fact. She wondered if she would ever become one of those faces, with the light of day only touching her memory briefly when a future descendant, if there was anyone out there, decided to flip through the pages of a dusty album. Or maybe she'd be deified online in a dramatic news story before being lost in an ocean of megabytes. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for until she came across a picture of her teenage self, somewhat surly, forced to pose next to all of the adults who smiled obediently at the camera. She noticed that surprisingly not much had changed. Her hair was still long and black. She'd maintained her figure, albeit fuller nowadays. She'd been a typical teenager, always wanting to escape her family, but for valid reasons. She knew that she ought to have attempted to follow in her parents' footsteps by now, had children in a successful marriage, achieved a respectable degree in a respectable career, living the cardboard cutout life that was expected of responsible adults. But she much preferred to drag her anchor. On the next page she saw a photo of her Aunt Jane, a lot younger but still large and looming, at the base of an oak tree and smiling widely, with one hand waving as the other one played with her ear. There were photos of Gwen and Uncle Sean on their honeymoon at the beach at Seaspray without a care in the world. In one he was shirtless, suntanned and strong, playfully grabbing Gwen from behind as she screamed through a raging smile. They seemed like different people, as she'd never seen him smile, or her aunt so playful. Gwen had said that it was just before his mother had passed, and they'd had to take Jane on, who'd been a handful. Back then, especially if you were poor, deaf people were treated as though they were mentally deficient. Even though Gwen was kind, Uncle Sean had been impatient and sometimes cruel. As Delwyn's mind drifted away, she was shaken by a hand that suddenly appeared on her shoulder. It was Gwen, but for a minute she was teleported back to the mirror, and she jumped with a start. "Old memories, love?" her aunt sighed. "Yeah." Delwyn slammed the album shut and turned to face her. "It must get lonely for you, Auntie Gwen." Gwen shrugged and picked up the coffee cups. "Depends on what you're used to, I suppose." She wandered into the kitchen and Delwyn followed her, picking up a tea towel to help with the dishes. "Do you miss Uncle Sean?" Her aunt shrugged again, which surprised Delwyn. "Not really, love." Then she stopped rinsing the cups. "Well, maybe a little, just a little." The women stood silently doing the dishes as the burnt orange sun settled in the window and the cicadas deepened their song. Delwyn thought about Duncan and realised that she didn't miss him at all. She wasn't lonely. She didn't miss anyone. She realised she could have been there on her own, and it really wouldn't have made a huge difference. She felt old before her time. Her mother would have been disgusted. She didn't care. It was enough that she was breathing. That night she wanted to feel something. She didn't know what, but she was sick of feeling like an empty vase with a lazy fly buzzing around inside. She wanted to feel connected or something. She took a long bath and washed her hair with soap. She liked feeling scrubbed and innocent. She climbed into flannel pyjamas and sat on the edge of her bed thinking about the mirror. It made her feel like a kid again. It was exciting. She wanted to explore, but she was afraid. What or who was that hand, and what did it want from her? What if she went into the mirror and couldn't come back? To what? Who cared? She didn't care, but she was afraid. Still sitting on the edge of the bed, watching the shadows lengthen on the wall, she decided that at midnight she would go to the mirror again. The butterflies in her stomach took flight. She wondered if she should leave a note. What could she possibly say? Nothing. Also, nothing would probably happen as she was crazy, and what happened earlier was a hallucination, just like everything else in her life. She listened for the stillness in the house, which had already arrived, yet she was unnerved by her decision to go back. She sat in stasis, but after a long wait, launched herself off the bed and padded over to the back door that led to the veranda. Pulling back the curtains, she saw the pale moon high in the sky, without a cloud to disturb it. The night was warm, but not too humid. She slowly opened the door and stepped out, remembering that she was barefoot. She turned around and scrambled to find her slippers under the bed, then slipped them on. As she snuck out the door and closed it quietly behind her, she heard a loud meow and turned to see Peter, the cat, stretching across the old table, his ginger fur almost white in the moonlight. She reached and scratched his head, but decided to get moving as the butterflies in her stomach urged her forward. She already had a flashlight, but didn't switch it on until she made it around the corner to the side of the house. In the distance she could hear the dairy cows softly mooing every now and then, and the nocturnal creatures scurrying through the bushes. She'd never been skittish with wildlife, although spiders were not a favourite of hers. Just then she heard tiny footsteps behind her, and before she could turn around she heard another meow. "Peter, piss off!" she hissed. Kicking the dirt in front of her to try and scare him off didn't work. It scattered a few leaves, but he kept coming. He purred and circled her ankles, seeming to enjoy the escapade. She decided to ignore him and turned to negotiate between the prickly bushes on the path to the flat. The moon shone the way, and she followed it faithfully as Peter galloped along, determined to join in. Occasionally she stopped to listen for an interloper or to see if Gwen had woken up to use the bathroom, but mostly she was nervous about what would happen in the flat. As she came to the walkway that led to the dark building, a thrill ran through her being, slightly tinged with fear. She slowly shone the flashlight up the path to the door and half expected to see someone standing there, but all was still and silent. She could see the remaining shells and other ornaments hanging on the door in the half-light. For a minute she turned the flashlight off to see what the place looked like in the glow of the moon. Everything seemed surreal and shimmered as though in a dream, but she decided that it was just her imagination. A breeze rustled the ivy that clung to the flat, and the smell of cypress and eucalyptus filled the air. Cypress seemed to be a central motif at Magpie Meadows, apart from the magpies themselves. The trees, the scent, the way it sculpted the landscape, there was something ancient and bewitching about the way it brought everything together. No matter what happened, if people passed away or the farm changed hands, the cypress stayed to oversee it all. Standing there in the clearing, facing the dark building, she felt as though time was standing still and she was at a crossroads. Even though she'd made the decision to come out that night and go back to the mirror, it was as though someone or something had made up her mind for her. She'd always felt like she was living someone else's life, like her own life had yet to begin. The expectations of others and pathways decided for her were like mazes for a mouse in a lab that belonged to somebody else. That's why she'd never felt like an adult, although she had gone through the motions such as getting a job, moving out, getting married, setting up house and so on. Duncan had always said that he could have kicked himself for falling for the broken dove routine. She had never understood that analogy and how she fit into it, as he'd been the one to pursue her, even after she'd turned him down, politely, so many times. She contemplated her tendency to run and hide as she stood there, possibly about to embark on an incredible adventure that amounted to the opposite of what her life had been. Or was it? Hiding wasn't the same as exploring. Not exactly. She flicked on the flashlight again, training it on the broken path to ensure even steps. She heard a short scream of a busy possum, but didn't falter. Slowly making her way to the door, she noticed a cat shadow stretching in front of her. She spun around and whispered loudly, "Peter!" He meowed a response, as though telling her to calm herself. She resigned herself to the fact that he was going along for the ride, no matter what. Besides, he had a right, it was his property. When she got to the door, she realised that she'd forgotten to bring the seahorse she'd found on her last trip. Shining the flashlight up and down the door for another intact specimen, she swore quietly to herself, although she had no idea why she might need it. Even though she'd never been superstitious, the idea of a touchstone calmed her. At any rate, when she looked up at the top of the door, she saw an even larger one hanging by a thread. It was a pale red in the light of the moon, so she snatched it down and put it in the pocket of her pyjamas. Feeling better about herself, she turned the handle and opened the door, noticing the thick darkness inside. Without skipping a beat, Peter ran in ahead of her and didn't look back. She shone the flashlight after him, but he was already gone. Stepping inside, she gingerly closed the door behind her, and it was then that she became just a little afraid of the dark. The light of the flashlight was enough to illuminate a small shard wherever she pointed it, and apart from her own footsteps there was nothing but silence. Deciding not to delay, even though her heart was pumping loud enough to hear, she made her way to the back room. Peter was already there, sitting patiently in front of the mirror. She could sense almost every hair on her skin prickling and standing to attention. She crept closer and pushed past the boxes and baskets. Peter was rubbing himself against a velvet curtain, purring, with apparently no clue as to what was behind it. With a whoosh, the curtain fell down and Delwyn squealed, instinctively shining the flashlight at it, but it was just herself standing there. No Peter. What she saw next made her blink hard to make sure she wasn't seeing things. Only his head popped out of the mirror at floor level. He was looking up at her. She jumped back in fright, nearly knocking over a stack of baskets. He meowed again and put one paw forward, but was eyeing her cautiously. In a panic, she leapt forward, trying to get a hold of him, but he turned around with only his tail sticking out of the mirror. She went to grab it, but it disappeared. As she stood there, almost hyperventilating, half bent with her left hand holding onto the frame, she realised that she had to try again. With a deep breath, she straightened up and this time put her right foot forward. She saw the mirror ripple very slightly as her toe effortlessly slipped through the surface. Slowly but surely she kept inching her foot through, feeling a gentle pins and needles sensation running up her leg. Nothing was grabbing her like last time. Propping the flashlight on the box next to the mirror, she was able to place her foot on a solid floor of some kind, and once she felt secure enough, she started leaning her face in as both hands gripped the frame, her knuckles white and trembling. The mirror was cool on the tip of her slightly upturned nose, and the pins and needles started spreading throughout her face. There was no stopping her now, so she pushed her whole head through. At first all she could see was static like on a TV screen, but silver. It was completely silent, and she could breathe normally, as much as she could with the excitement. She could still feel the solidity of the frames and her left foot still on the floor of the flat, which was odd and made her feel a little unbalanced. She slowly brought in her other foot and her right hand, but kept her left hand firmly on the frame. She noticed as she moved slightly forward, the static morphed somewhat to a more solid silver consistency, like liquid, and became more transparent. She didn't want to let go of the frame, but realized that she'd have to if she wanted to venture further. Before she did so, she decided to call for Peter. When she tried to speak, her voice came out like she was underwater, but with a faint echo. It was very peculiar, so she tried again. "Peter!" She called again a little louder, and then she heard his meow, also like underwater. "Meow?" He sounded further away, and a little annoyed. It was like he was trying to tell her that he was fine and to leave him alone. How did she understand this? As she came to grips with what was happening and where she was, she absent-mindedly let go of the frame. At once she freaked and turned around trying to find the mirror, but to no avail. She waved her hands around wildly, but tried to calm herself so that she could retrace her steps and not get lost. She slowly walked back to where she thought the mirror was, and then realized she was starting to see through the haze of the static. The silver atmosphere became more like water, and then like liquid crystal. Slowly but surely, faint light filtered through, and she could see that she was in some kind of a huge cave. She took tiny steps forward, and her footsteps made soft echoes as she went along. Curiosity had slowly chased away her fear, and she moved more purposefully now, taking greater strides. She started hearing what sounded like an ocean in the distance, and when her surroundings became clearer, she noticed that she was now in a massive cave that opened out into a deserted, moonlit beach. Even though she couldn't see any source of light in the cave, it was lit well enough for her to see that she was walking on a smooth, rock-like surface, and eventually she could hear the soft crunching of sand underfoot. It was wondrous, like a dream, and she marvelled at the idea of this incredible world being on the other side of a mirror in an abandoned granny flat. As she continued, contemplating the experience and wondering if she was dreaming or hallucinating, she heard Peter meowing in a friendly manner as though he was feeling the same way. Then she saw him, rolling around in the sand at the opening of the cave. She ran over to him and knelt down, rubbing his head, saying, "There you are, you little shit." She looked up and about at the magical scene, her jaw dropping as she stood back up to take it all in. It was night time, and the sky seemed enclosed like they were inside a huge sphere or tunnel. There was a pale pink moon in the distance, throwing hazy beams onto the rolling waves that lapped quietly on the violet shore. The edge of the cave was a part of the landscape that stretched around as far as her eyes could see, with dark woods and black rocks meeting the beach. Delwyn started walking along the shoreline to explore, and Peter lazily followed, stopping here and there to sniff the air and investigate. She took off her slippers and felt that the sand was slightly warm to the touch. She said aloud, "This is so bizarre." Peter meowed in response. Then she walked over to the water and waded in just to her ankles. It was also warm, and the waves and foam tickled her like lemonade. This prompted her to scoop some of the liquid up in her hands to smell and taste it. It was salty, with a hint of something long forgotten. She tried to remember but couldn't. Was it aniseed or dill? She got out of the water and stood on the sand, watching the strange purple waves slapping to the shore. The lavender foam sprayed Peter as he curiously attempted to catch it with his paws. He hissed and ran over to Delwyn as she laughed quietly at him. Despite the unease that was growing in her belly, she had to keep reminding herself that this could be an hallucination, but everything that had led up to her entering the mirror had been so mundane, and she'd not even gone to bed for the day. Also, Peter was with her, although that in itself was no evidence. The sky was almost black, the blackest purple she'd ever seen, and it became clear that almost everything in this world was some shade of purple, such as lilac, lavender, indigo, violet, fuchsia, amethyst, magenta, maroon, plum, orchid, grape and eggplant. She decided to explore, but before she took off, she looked around for something to use as a marker so she could find her way back. It was as though Peter understood her intentions, and he ran to the bushes behind them and meowed in an old branch that had fallen. "Thanks, matey," she said warmly, and tickled his left ear, making him purr triumphantly. She dragged out the branch, which was the same length and width as her arm, and was such a pale lilac that it was almost white. She impaled the sand with it near the entrance of the cave, and then took off her pyjama jacket, seeing as the temperature was so mild and she was wearing a tank top underneath. She tied the jacket to the branch like a flag, and they took off down the purple shoreline. To most people, ending up in an alternate realm such as this would have been a shocking development, which might have resulted in a psychotic break, irreversible damage or dementia. For Delwyn this was par for the course, but the sane side of her had all the questions and knew that this was impossible in the real scientific world, to be exploring a mirror realm. Notwithstanding new developments in quantic physics, alternate or parallel universes, the insane side of her accepted this new development with open arms. The dreamer in her was a strong alter ego and had always sought dominance, fighting against the will to fit into a normal society. Even though her experiences with the paranormal hinted at another realm that begged to be explored, she had heeded her doctor, husband, family, and society at large when she turned her back against these abnormalities and grasped the flimsy, cure-all safety nets they'd given her, such as they were. The pills, the inadequate therapy, the leaden expectation that went along with the panaceas, that she would behave herself and recognise those bizarre turns as nightmares or synapses misfiring, felt to her like an iron lung, too heavy to do any good and too cumbersome to shake off easily when she deemed it time to do so. Those shackles that her keepers had placed on her had weighed her down to the point of making her feel as though she would plummet into an early grave. She felt it in her bones. Her very spirit had been squashed. Now here she was, free, roaming around in a world where none of those robots could find her. They would tell her that she was having a breakdown for sure. She laughed and was surprised to see small violet birds flying out of her mouth into the dark purple sky. In shock, her hands involuntarily went up to her mouth in case more flew out, and Peter meowed excitedly, racing along the shore trying in earnest to catch them. Delwyn gasped and noticed that the sound still had a strange echo like a reverberation, although different to when she was in the cave. As she wondered about the possibilities in this world, she heard a boiling sound coming from further out in the sea. She looked over and saw, about 30 feet away, the ocean bubbling and frothing, with the sound of hissing building in her ears. She strained to see what on earth it could be, but she wasn't on Earth, was she? Looking over to check on Peter, who was rolling around in the sand again, oblivious to the commotion, she started backing away, just in case danger was approaching. The bubbling and hissing was building in momentum. She called out to Peter, who ignored her and stared at the sea nonchalantly, like he was watching something boring on TV. She backed up as far as she could, until she came up against the black cliff wall, when suddenly the surface of the water was broken by something, rising quickly and heading straight to the shore. Peter didn't move, and Delwyn was too shocked to scream. As the creature approached, her heart stopped in terror, due to the fact that it had crossed over the shoreline and was now floating in mid-air, making a beeline for her. Delwyn squealed but couldn't run. She couldn't figure out exactly what she was looking at. It was kind of humanoid, but with a head like a seahorse. It had arms and a man's torso, but no legs. It had a tail like a seahorse as well. Its colour was luminescent with shades of green, blue and silver. Somehow she knew it wasn't going to hurt her, but she was still afraid. It stopped in front of her, hovering, with the hissing at fever pitch, pointing its finger in her face. Finally speaking in a raspy male voice, it said, "Intruder!" The hissing continued, but she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Delwyn stammered in response, "What?" The seahorse man continued pointing and shaking his finger at her, his head shimmering in the pink moonlight. Then he crossed his arms angrily and rasped, "You weren't invited, and you are present in physical form, not in sub-mind. You're an intruder!" He yelled the last words into her face, and she screamed, shocked by the volume, as well as the strange smell of his breath, which blasted in unison. It was a curious combination of ozone, aniseed, and fish. Even though her mind was racing with a million questions, she had no words to utter, as she was speechless. She just stared dumbly until he finally leaved in and said menacingly, "Well, cat got your tongue?" It was then that Peter made his presence known, with a friendly meow. Obviously confused, the creature unfolded his arms and jerked his head this way and that, looking downwards, with his webbed hands waving in the air. She was too afraid to move until she realized that the hissing had stopped. Peter started purring as the creature reached down and picked him up lovingly. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, but half expected to see him chomp into her feline companion. Then the raspy voice said gently, "Oh, Pusscat, hello, Pusscat. I didn't see you there. What a sweetie." Delwyn shook her head disbelievingly to see Peter in the arms of the seahorse man, who was stroking and petting him. They were both in total rapture. She slowly stood up straight and tried to think about what to do next. Should she try to run back to the mirror? As she entertained that very thought, the creature turned to her and said, "No, there's no need. I'm sorry I frightened you, but you are interloping in my territory." He continued petting Peter and didn't seem as concerned. She decided to engage him. "Who are you?" Even though she wanted to ask what he was. He put Peter down on the sand and turned to her, this time almost shy, but at the same time a little indignant. She noticed that his big green eyes were smiling. "I am Varun, guardian of one soul, the Dreamworld. And who are you, intruder?" Shaking, she weakly took his hand, noticing that it felt like holding a fish. "I'm Delwyn, and I didn't mean to intrude. I was following Peter, the cat." Varun started floating towards her, appraising and shaking his head. "One soul is not for those in physical form. How is it that you are here in physicality?" he hissed, a little gentler this time. Physicality? Delwyn found his riddles perplexing. He stopped circling her and pointed to the shore, where there was a pearlescent boat that wasn't there before. It was shaped like a half-clan and was controlled by a strange creature who seemed to be made out of transparent blue rubber with no features or hair. The inside of the boat was lined with padded crimson velvet. Varun drifted over to it and motioned for Delwyn to climb aboard, as Peter had already jumped in, making himself comfortable next to the rubber man. It was remarkable how unafraid he was. The rubber man tickled Peter behind the ears, then picked up the oars, waiting for Varun's command. Delwyn hesitated on the shore as Varun floated with ease onto the vessel. "Where are we going?" she asked. Varun laughed, hissing all the while. The rubber man looked as though he was laughing too, with one hand holding his belly, even though he didn't have a mouth and was silent.
"Why would you ask such a thing? In a realm such as this, silly woman?"
He laughed again and patted the seat next to him. Delwyn contemplated the level of difficulty of climbing into the strange boat, and Varun grew impatient with her, saying,
"Come along now. Are you always afraid?"
He looked at Peter, who seemed totally at peace with the whole scenario. Besides, she was in another dimension, so why shouldn't she just go with the flow? In any other dream, hallucination or astral adventure, she would have either drifted along blissfully or at least only been half aware of what was going on and therefore not been in control. So what was different here? She was awake and not under the influence. This was real, and perhaps so was the danger. She comforted herself with the fact that Peter, being an animal and supposedly having instincts beyond human capacity, could sense danger before she could. If he was okay, then she would be too. It suited her for the time being. As she lifted her right leg, the boat dipped to allow her to step in easily. It wasn't so hard after all. She sat down in the middle between the rubber man and Varun, still feeling like she was hallucinating. Varun clapped his hands 3 times and said,
"All right, oarsman, time to heave-ho."
The rubber man started rowing, and straight away the boat started moving into the air. Delwyn squealed a little and gripped the side of the boat. Varun raised his peculiar eyebrows.
"You do squeal a lot, don't you?"
The boat kept soaring into the air, and the rubber man continued rowing. Peter jumped up on the edge of the boat, obviously fascinated with the goings-on. Delwyn yelled out, "Peter, be careful!" He looked back at her with annoyance. She was obviously a killjoy.
"Oh, leave him alone. He's safe with us. What's the matter with you?"
She looked closely at Varun, who was looking off in the moon's direction, smiling a secret smile. She asked him again, "Where are we going? Please answer my questions." Varun turned to look at her and cocked his seahorse head.
"Why, we're going to the moon, of course. You seek illumination, don't you?"
Illumination? She was dumbfounded, but thrilled with the nonsense of it.
"It's delicious. You must try it."
She noticed the colours of his skin changing from blue, green, to aqua, to purple, then pink. "Delicious?" she asked. The rubber man, Peter and Varun all looked at each other like they were all in on a secret joke and shook their heads. Delwyn pouted, all of a sudden the outsider and not liking it. Varun floated over to her and put his arm around her. Again she could smell aniseed. At least the hissing had stopped.
"Here you are, in a magical world where anything is possible, and you're asking silly questions and having a tantrum."
She looked up at him and realised that he was right. She was acting like a spoilt brat. They were high up in the air, in a world about which she had no idea, and she should have been having the time of her life. It suddenly dawned on her that she was still inside the mirror. She freaked and asked Varun what the time was. He laughed and said, "Haven't you heard about the Dreamworld?" She shook her head and said, "No riddles, please." Varun smiled.
"Every hour in the world of dreams is but a minute in the mortal world, my dear."
"Really?" Varun was obviously already growing tired of her.
"You really shouldn't be here in physical form."
"Why do you keep saying physical form?" Then the hissing started again. "And what is that noise, that hissing?" Varun ignored her and it answered her first question.
"You are here in physical form. You should only be present in sub-mind, in your dreams."
It started sinking in. She realised that he meant her physical presence. "So, this is the dream world." Varun sighed and his colours changed again, from pink and purple to hues of orange, red and yellow.
"I very much detest repeating myself. Pay attention and absorb, interloper."
Peter meowed and Varun snorted.
"He knows. He also grows weary of your incessant questions."
The rubber man started jiggling about as though laughing again, his hand holding his stomach. Delwyn was a little defiant. "Well, I don't care. This is a whole new world and I need to know everything." As they floated through the dark purple sky, Varun attempted to enlighten Delwyn, but he advised that until she had some real illumination, she wouldn't fully understand the scope of what could be achieved in this realm. She looked over the side of the boat and saw that the land below had morphed into a kaleidoscope of dark jewels. They were getting closer to the pink moon, which almost seemed like a ball of fairy floss. She could see wisps of vapour flying off here and there, like flares from the sun. She started to freak a little. "Is it safe on the moon?" Varun and the rubber man laughed. Peter had jumped up on the edge of the boat again, fascinated with the sight of the looming pink ball. "You are in the realm of the subconscious. The only thing that is not safe is you." She frowned at him, but he ignored her and yelled at the rubber man, "Full steam ahead, oarsman!" Suddenly the rubber man turned into a massive blue sail, which billowed above them and projected them faster towards their destination. Varun grabbed Peter, who snuggled against his chest, and Delwyn gripped the side of the boat for her dear life. No matter what Varun was saying about safety, she couldn't help taking precautions. As they approached the pink moon, she heard strange sounds, like whispering, but it was so faint she could hardly detect it. There was a wonderful scent in the air, like a mixture of strawberries, vanilla and rose. They started drifting through some of the wispy vapours, which were like clouds but not as well formed. She could see what looked like a broken ring around the moon, like a floating platform or the rings of Saturn, beneath the layers of vapours. She could see flags spread out along the platform every 10 feet or so, with different symbols on them. They were metallic and all coloured differently, suspended in mid-air. Varun ordered the rubber man to slow down. Straight away he morphed back into humanoid form and took a hold of the oars, navigating carefully between the wispy pink clouds. As they passed a few of them, Delwyn could see a lot of activity on the platform, with people running back and forth, bringing food, drinking and carousing. There was a lot of chatter and laughter, and she saw that they were dressed in the fashion of the royalty in the Arabian Nights. Varun commanded the rubber man, "Take us to Moonray Station, oarsman, and don't spare the horses." As soon as he uttered his command, 4 creatures appeared in front of their boat, half horse, half fish. The horse parts were pearly white and the fish parts were glittery pink. Delwyn gasped, "Oh, how lovely! What are they?" Varun was pleased with her admiration of his work. "They're known as hippocamps." Peter meowed and Varun rolled his eyes. "Well, they can be called hippocampi too. They're mythological beasts from the Greek. You know, Poseidon used them to pull his chariot." He appeared proud of this fact, as though name-dropping. Making their way to Moonray Station, Delwyn watched the pearly manes of the hippocamps billow elegantly as they galloped through the wispy pink, vaporous atmosphere. She saw a huge, multicoloured metallic elevation on the platform with a purple flag flying high that read Moonray Station in gold lettering, with a symbol on it that looked familiar to her. It was a combination of a heart with a rose inside it, with beams shooting out of it. Varun yelled, "We have arrived! Prepare to dock!" The hippocamps gently pulled alongside the platform and stopped at the main deck, where many people were sitting at long tables, covered with purple velvet tablecloths edged with gold. There were servers carrying large gold trays of sparkling food and drinks. They were also dressed like characters from the Arabian Nights, resplendent with the colours purple, gold, and sometimes crimson and forest green. The rubber man helped Delwyn onto the deck and Peter leapt off, obviously excited at the smell of food. Varun floated over to an empty table and waved them over as the rubber man tended to the hippocamps. They sat down on comfortable chairs with plush velvet cushions that were coloured in deep tones. The table had a golden cruet set in the middle, a sweet little crystal vase with a purple rose in it, and purple and white candles flickering in gold candle holders. Varun snapped his fingers in a haughtily fashion and called out, "Garçon!" A handsome young waiter dressed in jewel-coloured silk came over immediately and bowed in obeisance. "Yes, sir. May I be of assistance?"
"Yes, of course. The intruder and I would like a glass of your finest moon milk. Also, a plate of creamed kippers and a bowl of moon milk for my feline friend, at your earliest convenience."
Before the waiter could respond, Delwyn snapped, "My name's Delwyn. Stop calling me intruder." Varun and the waiter shared knowing glances. Then Varun apologised.
"Oh, my manners. Delwyn, of course."
The waiter said, "As you wish," and disappeared with a flourish. Varun couldn't help himself, though, and he turned to Delwyn and said,
"You know, I must tell you, Delwyn, you are very lucky that I am allowing you to stay, especially as you are present in physical form. Usually, this is a realm for dreaming minds only."
She shrugged and said, "So, we've established the fact that I'm here in person, rather than my dream self, and I'm sorry for that. This is all new to me, so please be patient. I didn't know this world existed behind the mirror." Varun gasped and Peter hissed as though she was supposed to keep it a secret.
"A mirror, you say? How intriguing."
Varun rubbed his chin with his webbed fingers, but looked at her as though he didn't quite believe her. "Yes, a mirror. I thought you might know about it," she replied, checking Peter for a response. She was getting used to treating him more like a human now. He was alert, watching both Varun and Delwyn closely, obviously understanding what was being discussed and interested in the outcome. Varun studied her, much like a psychiatrist might study a patient, and his eyes smiled and changed to a pleasing orange pastel.
"Maybe it was one of your hallucinations," he said thoughtfully.
"What?" Delwyn was horrified and embarrassed, even though he was half man, half seahorse. "How dare you?" she continued, although half-heartedly now. "You don't even know me." Varun and Peter exchanged glances, as if to say, "Here she goes again." "And what's going on here with you and Peter?" "He's a cat." Varun laughed, and Peter meowed indignantly, then hissed a tiny hiss at her. She shrunk back. "Sorry, but you are." Varun smiled.
"Oh, come on now, grumpy girl. You're in a wondrous land and you're still behaving like a spoiled brat."
He was right, and she did feel guilty, but then she was distracted by a beautiful woman making her way towards them with a tray of drinks. She was tall, with long black hair, and was wearing a purple pirate dress complete with purple headscarf, black corset, and buccaneer boots. There was something familiar about her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She had a name tag on her jacket that read, Daphne Pink. When she reached the table, she smiled at Delwyn and asked, "Is the bowl for the kitty?" Peter meowed and purred, and Delwyn smiled back and nodded, feeling an ache in her heart for some strange reason. The woman placed the pearly bowl in front of Peter, which was filled with pale pink milk that had an almost invisible mist above it. He started lapping straight away and was purring even louder, obviously enjoying it immensely. Delwyn said, "That looks delicious." Varun answered, "The finest in all of One-Soul. Isn't that so, serving wench?" The woman laughed and retorted, "Watch it, fish face." He laughed back, and Delwyn noticed that there was something between the two, some kind of knowledge or history that was hard to define. The woman placed a tall, pearly glass of moon milk in front of Delwyn and handed one to Varun. She then strutted off, turning back to wink and smile at Delwyn. A chill ran through her body. What was it about that woman? She was so familiar. Delwyn took a sip of her drink and felt the mist tickle her nose like the tiny bubbles of lemonade. It was the most delicious thing she'd ever had, and she marvelled at the fact that she could taste anything at all. It was like strawberries and vanilla, and with an aftertaste of fairy floss or cotton candy, something sugary and decadent. She couldn't quite detect whether it was angelica or musk. It was quite strange. She asked Varun, "Hey, if this is the dream world, then why can we drink or eat things?" He snorted, "Horses eat hay." She frowned at him, puzzled and annoyed. "I beg your pardon?" He was slurping his drink loudly, quite uncouth, with his long seahorsey snout. He sat back and said, "Ah! I said, horses eat hay." She realized he was referring to her saying hay. She rolled her eyes at him. "Oh, I'm sorry, but please answer me. Why can we eat or drink here? Isn't this the dream world?"
"Yes, it is, and why not?"
She knew better than to continue with this train of thought. It was obvious that he was going to be difficult. Her eyes lit up as she saw the woman coming back, and Varun noticed. She was serving the table next to them, and she placed a tray on the surface, passing an ivory plate that was gilt-edged with gold, and held what looked like a piece of cheesecake, only with the same kind of substance that the pink moon was made of. Delwyn asked, "Is that stuff from the moon?" The woman answered, "Naturally, with a few extra special ingredients, of course." Varun piped up, "The same things are in your moon milk, so drink up. Besides, you have so many questions. This will help you absorb or understand the answers. You came here for illumination, didn't you?" Delwyn hesitated a bit and looked around to see other people enjoying the moon milk and pie. She wondered if they were actual people or dreaming versions of themselves. The woman answered her, obviously able to read her thoughts. "They're a mixture. Some are real, some are versions, but the real ones aren't from your world." Varun interrupted, obviously annoyed that the woman told her that much.
"However, you must not talk with them until I tell you it's all right."
The hissing had started up again. He gave the woman a venomous look, and the woman shrank back, mouthing the word, "Sorry." She handed Peter his plate of creamed kippers, and when she tried to refill Varun's glass, he waved her away. As she walked off, she looked at Delwyn over her shoulder with a sad look on her face. Delwyn felt a pang in her gut and didn't know why. She asked Varun, "Who was she? She's oddly familiar." He smiled and shook off his bad mood.
"Pay no mind, and drink. Are your kippers to your satisfaction, Peter?"
Peter was doing the growling that cats do when thoroughly enjoying a meal and worrying that someone else will steal it. Varun laughed.
"Oh, don't worry, my friend. There's more where that came from."
Peter stopped growling and started purring, gobbling up every morsel. Delwyn tilted back her head and down to the rest of her moon milk. She asked why they weren't having pie.
"It's enough to be having the milk. Go easy in this realm, Delwyn. Small steps. Don't be a glutton."
She pouted. "Well, how is it that Peter can have both food and drink?" Varun smiled as though waiting for that very question.
"Peter is welcome here. Ha ha!"
Delwyn glared at Varun, but decided against making a big deal out of it. He was an odd creature, and this was an odd world. She had to keep reminding herself that it didn't really matter in the scheme of things. Then she started feeling quite peculiar. She noticed that Varun was watching her intently. So was Peter. She looked over his head and saw that the rubber man was sitting in the pearly boat, and he was also watching her. A strange sensation was coming over her, as though every cell in her body was filling up with knowledge. It became apparent to her that they were indeed in dreamland. She was in the world of dreams, or to be more precise, the collective unconscious. She was physically present in the subconscious, everyone's subconscious or realm of the subconscious or unconscious. Her mind was racing with all the concepts, and she was finding it hard to keep up. The mirror was a portal to this realm, a realm that was normally only accessible through sleep, and the mirror was an aberration, but she couldn't see far back enough to see how or why the mirror came about, or how it came into the hands of her aunt. She started blathering, but could make no sense as her mind was still racing. Varun was smiling with his eyes, as he was wildly excited. He loved this part. Delwyn came to understand that being in this realm, in a physical state, would be even more powerful than lucid dreaming. She could have total control if she could be mature enough to understand the ramifications of her psychological nature. She could decipher what growth was needed and what she could manipulate with her understanding. After the flood of realizations, she was exhausted and sat in stunned silence. Varun reached over and took her hand, saying in a gentle voice, "3 more things, my dear." She nodded, absolutely dumbfounded, her head fat with information. Peter was curled up in his chair, purring and snoozing. 1. There are repressed memories, shadows, darkness and secrets that will come to the fore. Do you have the strength and wisdom to face them? 2. You must refrain from using this realm as a playground. You must use it as one would a university. There is so much to learn, so don't waste your time here. This place will turn on you if you do. And 3, he paused to make sure that he had her full attention. Do not tell anybody about the mirror. This is very important, Delwyn. She noticed that the hissing was getting louder, and Varun had floated close to her for emphasis, his eyes now the blackest of black, chilling her to the bone. If you bring anyone else into this realm, I cannot guarantee the safety of the dreamers or of the mortals in your world. Do you understand that this is very important, an important rule that you must obey? No more intruders! He yelled the last word. She felt tears welling up. Yes, I promise I won't tell a soul. Varun relaxed a little and cocked his head to the side. His eyes went back to green and the hissing stopped. Good. He floated around to Peter and picked him up, motioning to Delwyn to follow. No more questions now, silly woman. It's time for you and Peter to return. I will send you a sign in your dreams to indicate the time for your next visit. Let us return to the portal. With that, they slipped into the boat, and the rubber man clapped his hands to rouse the hippocamps. They then galloped through the purple sky back to the warm violet shores. When they got out of the boat, Delwyn turned to thank them, but they disappeared, apart from Varun. He put Peter down on the sand and said, Follow him. He'll take you back. Remember your silence and do not attempt to return until you receive a sign from me. Delwyn nodded and went to hug him, but he reared back a little, apparently slightly embarrassed. She said goodbye and ran off after Peter, who led her back to the cave and into the mist of the static. She could see the outline of the mirror and ran for it with her arms outstretched, finally making it to the other side, into the subdued light of the room in the flat. She could see Peter racing ahead of her straight to the front door. She spun around to look at the mirror. Did all that just happen? She was absolutely delirious with excitement. It was the most amazing experience she'd ever had in her life. At that moment she started wondering if she'd hallucinated yet again, so she reached into the mirror, but no, her hand sunk in, so it was all real. She draped the curtain back over it, grabbed the flashlight and took one last look to make sure that it seemed as though nothing untoward had happened. She wondered if Gwen knew anything about the mirror, but would not ask, not only because she promised Varun, but because she didn't want to seem like she'd finally gone around the twist, if it was all fantasy. And what if it was a fantasy? Then this was really the biggest episode of her life, and there was no hope for her. For some reason, that didn't frighten her. Reality was more of a threat. It was death in comparison, especially now. As she left the flat, she noticed that it was still night time and the moon was in approximately the same spot that it had been when she'd first entered the building. Peter scampered off and she followed him, thinking that it felt like they'd been away for hours. Just in case, she ran back into her room to check the clock. Only 3.5 minutes had passed. She was so exhausted but wanted to record all that had happened in her journal. She did so in a dreamlike state, going over and over everything to ensure she didn't skip a thing. Why had the woman been so familiar? Who did she remind her of? Varun also reminded her of someone, even though he was half human, half seahorse. She was dying to share it with someone, but had to keep her mouth shut. How excruciating. She knew that she would definitely have to find a great hiding spot for this journal.